Historical records indicate that the fate of politically disgraced queens was rarely sealed in the dramatic immediacy described by later legend. More often, their removal unfolded through bureaucratic precision, legal ritual, and quiet confinement. Across medieval and early modern Europe, monasteries functioned not merely as religious institutions, but as instruments embedded within systems of governance. For queens whose presence threatened dynastic stability, monastic enclosure provided a solution that balanced political necessity with the outward appearance of moral legitimacy. Contemporary accounts describe how royal women existed at the intersection of lineage, diplomacy, and succession. Their marriages forged alliances, secured territorial claims, and produced heirs whose legitimacy underpinned the continuity of ruling houses. When queens fell from favor, through accusations of adultery, infertility, factional rivalry, or association with failed political coalitions, their continued visibility at court could destabilize fragile balances of power. Chroniclers noted that deposition or execution of queens carried significant risks, particularly when their natal families commanded military or diplomatic influence. Monastic confinement therefore emerged as a mechanism that neutralized political threat without provoking open conflict. Surviving legal documents suggest that the process often began with carefully constructed charges framed within moral or religious language. Allegations of impropriety provided justification for removal while avoiding explicit acknowledgement of political motivations. Ecclesiastical courts occasionally participated, lending authority to proceedings that blurred the boundary between spiritual discipline and dynastic strategy. Legal codes of the period reveal that noble women could be compelled to take religious vows under varying degrees of coercion, though the formal appearance of voluntary devotion was usually maintained to preserve reputational stability for ruling families. Queens sent to monasteries experienced a transformation not only of environment, but of identity. The material culture of queenship, ceremonial dress, public audiences, and administrative participation was replaced by regulated daily rhythms structured around prayer, communal labor, and supervised silence. Yet contemporary correspondence indicates that confinement did not necessarily erase political significance. Even within enclosure, former queens retained symbolic authority derived from their lineage and former status. Letters preserved in monastic archives demonstrate ongoing communication with relatives, patrons, and occasionally political factions seeking to exploit their legitimacy. The degree of restriction varied widely depending on the political circumstances surrounding each deposition. Some queens were placed in prestigious abbeys that housed aristocratic women and maintained close relationships with ruling courts. In such environments, material comfort could remain substantial. Inventories from certain monastic residences list private chambers, personal servants, and allowances that reflected the former queen's rank. Chroniclers noted that these arrangements allowed ruling authorities to demonstrate respect while ensuring effective isolation from courtly intrigue. Other cases reveal far harsher conditions. Queens associated with rebellion, contested succession, or foreign alliances perceived as threatening were sometimes confined in remote houses where surveillance was more rigorous. Monastic rules could be selectively enforced to limit visitors, correspondence, and access to resources. Surviving visitation records from ecclesiastical authorities occasionally reference instructions to restrict external contact, illustrating how spiritual discipline functioned alongside political containment. In these settings, the psychological dimensions of confinement became as significant as the physical boundaries. Political calculations surrounding fertility played a decisive role in determining the treatment of disgraced queens. Historical records indicate that women who had produced heirs retained a degree of protection because their maternal connection to the succession rendered extreme punishment politically hazardous. Monastic confinement allowed ruling powers to separate the queen from influence over her children while avoiding the destabilizing implications of maternal martyrdom. Conversely, queens whose marriages failed to produce heirs often faced more precarious outcomes, as their removal could be framed as a necessary step toward dynastic continuity through remarriage of the king. Contemporary diplomatic correspondence reveals that natal families frequently negotiated the terms of confinement. Dowries, inheritance claims, and territorial arrangements remained entangled with the queen's fate. In some instances, monastic residence functioned as part of broader settlements designed to prevent military confrontation between ruling houses. Financial provisions allocated to confined queens can be traced in treasury records, demonstrating that their maintenance was not merely charitable, but politically strategic. Sustaining their dignity within enclosure reduced the likelihood of external intervention motivated by perceived mistreatment. The lived realities within monastic spaces were shaped by hierarchies that mirrored broader social structures. Former queens entered communities governed by abbesses whose authority derived from both religious office and aristocratic background. Chroniclers noted moments of tension when royal expectations collided with communal discipline. Some abbesses leveraged the presence of a royal resident to enhance the prestige and patronage of their institution, while others emphasized strict adherence to rule as a means of reinforcing spiritual equality. Surviving rulebooks and visitation reports illustrate ongoing negotiation between privilege and conformity. Long-term confinement produced complex patterns of adaptation. Letters and devotional writings attributed to former queens suggest varying degrees of engagement with religious life. Some embraced intellectual and spiritual pursuits, commissioning manuscripts, supporting charitable activities, and participating in theological discourse. Monastic libraries occasionally expanded through royal patronage, leaving material traces of these contributions. However, other accounts imply persistent resistance, expressed through petitions for release, appeals to relatives, or efforts to influence political developments beyond the cloister. The political utility of monastic confinement extended beyond the immediate removal of a queen from court. It also served as a public demonstration of moral order restored after perceived disruption. Chroniclers frequently framed these confinements within narratives of repentance and divine justice, reinforcing the ideological legitimacy of ruling authorities. At the same time, the absence of public execution avoided the creation of martyrs whose deaths might galvanize opposition. The monastery thus operated as a space where political problems could be contained within a framework of religious propriety. Surviving chronicles describe how the passage of time gradually altered the political significance of confined queens. As new marriages produced heirs and court factions realigned, the perceived threat posed by a former queen often diminished. In some cases, this led to partial relaxation of restrictions, allowing increased correspondence, movement within monastic networks, or participation in family events under supervision. Financial accounts occasionally reflect adjustments in allowances corresponding to shifts in political climate, indicating that confinement was not static but responsive to broader developments. Yet the possibility of renewed political relevance never entirely disappeared. Succession crises, premature deaths of heirs, or factional struggles could revive interest in individuals long removed from power. Historical records include instances where confined queens became focal points for opposition movements seeking alternative claims to legitimacy. Authorities responded by reinforcing surveillance, relocating the queen to more secure institutions, or restricting contact further. These measures demonstrate that monastic confinement functioned as an adaptable instrument within evolving power dynamics. The emotional dimensions of these experiences are more difficult to reconstruct, though fragments emerge through devotional texts and administrative correspondence. Expressions of resignation, spiritual reflection, and occasional frustration appear within surviving writings, suggesting a spectrum of responses shaped by personal temperament and political context. Chroniclers rarely centered the interior lives of these women, yet the persistence of petitions and negotiated privileges indicates ongoing efforts to assert agency within constrained circumstances. Legal traditions concerning widowhood and queenship also intersected with patterns of confinement. Queens who lost political protection through the death or deposition of their husbands faced uncertain futures, particularly when their presence complicated the legitimacy of new regimes. Monastic residence provided a socially acceptable destination that aligned with expectations of piety while ensuring political neutrality. In some cases, widowed queens voluntarily entered monasteries to secure autonomy and protection, blurring the distinction between imposed and chosen enclosure. Material traces preserved within monastic architecture and burial sites offer further insight into the long-term consequences of these confinements. Tomb inscriptions, donor records, and artistic commissions reflect attempts by former queens to shape their legacy despite political displacement. These commemorations often emphasized humility, devotion, and reconciliation, aligning personal memory with broader narratives of moral restoration. At the same time, The continued visibility of royal symbols within monastic contexts reveals the enduring intersection of sacred space and dynastic identity. The cumulative evidence suggests that monastic confinement represented neither complete erasure nor quiet retirement, but a calculated reconfiguration of power. By relocating queens into controlled religious environments, ruling authorities managed potential sources of instability while preserving diplomatic relationships and ideological coherence. The monastery became a site where political necessity, gender expectations, and religious authority converged, producing outcomes that were simultaneously restrictive and symbolically complex. Over generations, these practices contributed to the institutionalization of monasteries as instruments within governance strategies affecting elite women. The pattern reinforced broader assumptions about female political agency, emphasizing containment over confrontation and moral framing over explicit acknowledgement of power struggles. Chroniclers recorded these transitions with restrained language, yet the persistence of the practice across diverse kingdoms underscores its perceived effectiveness within the political logic of the period. Within cloistered walls, the daily routines of prayer, labor, and regulated silence coexisted with memories of courtly life and the enduring implications of royal lineage. The tension between withdrawal and continued symbolic presence defined the experience of many confined queens, leaving a legacy preserved not through dramatic episodes, but through administrative records, devotional writings, and the quiet continuity of institutions designed to absorb political disruption without visible rupture. Surviving documents suggest that the administrative management of confined queens required continuous coordination between royal courts, ecclesiastical authorities, and the monastic communities themselves. Financial registers reveal carefully structured allowances allocated for clothing, servants, devotional materials, and occasional travel within permitted religious networks. These provisions were rarely acts of generosity alone. They represented calculated investments in stability. Maintaining a former queen in conditions reflecting her rank reduced the risk of scandal, diplomatic grievance, or political agitation that might arise from perceived mistreatment. Contemporary account books from royal treasuries indicate that expenses related to confined queens were often categorized alongside diplomatic obligations. This placement within financial administration underscores how monastic confinement remained embedded in broader statecraft, rather than existing purely within the realm of private or spiritual life. Payments for repairs to monastic chambers, gifts to abbesses, and stipends for attendants demonstrate that the queen's presence could reshape the economic landscape of the institution hosting her. In some cases, monasteries benefited significantly from royal patronage connected to such arrangements, reinforcing their willingness to cooperate with political authorities. Legal petitions preserved in archival collections reveal that queens did not always accept confinement passively. Appeals requesting modification of restrictions, clarification of property rights, or improved communication with relatives appear intermittently across centuries. These petitions were frequently framed in respectful, religious language emphasizing obedience, while simultaneously asserting entitlement to dignity and familial connection. The careful phrasing reflects an awareness that overt resistance could be interpreted as further justification for restriction, whereas appeals grounded in spiritual humility might elicit sympathetic review. Chroniclers noted that the question of property and dowry frequently persisted long after a queen's removal from court. Land revenues, movable wealth, and inheritance claims continued to generate negotiation between ruling authorities and the queen's natal family. Monastic residence complicated these disputes because religious vows could affect legal capacity to manage assets. Surviving legal commentary indicates that special dispensations were sometimes issued to allow confined queens limited control over property, particularly when financial independence reduced the likelihood of external political intervention. The presence of a former queen within a monastery could alter internal dynamics in subtle but significant ways. Monastic chronicles occasionally reference increased visitation by nobles seeking spiritual counsel, patronage opportunities, or discreet political conversation. Although official regulations often restricted such interactions, enforcement depended heavily on local circumstances and the disposition of monastic leadership. Some abbesses perceived strategic advantage in facilitating carefully monitored contact, recognizing that association with royal lineage could elevate the monastery's influence within regional networks of power. Historical records indicate that monastic education played an important role in shaping the intellectual lives of confined queens. Access to scriptoria, theological works, and correspondence networks allowed some to engage deeply with religious scholarship. Manuscript dedications and marginal notes attributed to royal residents provide evidence of sustained literacy and intellectual participation. These activities did not necessarily diminish political awareness. Rather, they created alternative avenues through which queens could maintain relevance, particularly by supporting religious reform movements or charitable initiatives that enhanced their reputation beyond the cloister. Diplomatic correspondence from foreign courts occasionally references confined queens as figures of continued symbolic importance. Even when physically isolated, their lineage and marital history could influence international perceptions of legitimacy. Ambassadors sometimes inquired about their welfare, requested permission for communication, or monitored their treatment as indicators of political stability within the kingdom. Such attention reinforced the need for ruling authorities to balance restriction with visible respect, ensuring that monastic confinement did not become a source of diplomatic friction. The relationship between confinement and succession politics remained particularly sensitive. Surviving chronicles describe moments when the death of a king, the minority of an heir, or the outbreak of factional conflict renewed interest in previously marginalized queens. Their potential to serve as regents, alternative claimants, or symbols of continuity prompted careful reassessment of restrictions. Authorities occasionally tightened surveillance during periods of uncertainty, relocating queens to monasteries with stronger security or limiting correspondence to prevent their involvement in political maneuvering. Gender expectations embedded within legal and religious frameworks shaped how confinement was interpreted by contemporaries. Queens were often portrayed within narratives emphasizing repentance, humility, and withdrawal from worldly ambition. These portrayals served political objectives by transforming a potentially contentious removal into a morally intelligible transition. However, legal codes and theological commentary also reveal underlying anxieties about female authority, particularly when queens had exercised significant influence during their tenure at court. Monastic enclosure thus functioned as both practical containment and symbolic reaffirmation of gendered boundaries within governance. Surviving evidence suggests that relationships between confined queens and their children were subject to deliberate regulation. Guardianship arrangements for royal heirs frequently limited maternal contact, reflecting concerns that emotional bonds could translate into political influence. Letters requesting visits or updates on children appear within archival collections, illustrating the personal dimensions of policies primarily motivated by dynastic calculation. In some instances, controlled reunions were permitted during religious festivals or significant family events, demonstrating attempts to balance familial expectations with political precaution. The passage of years often produced gradual integration of former queens into the spiritual identity of their monastic communities. Obituary records, commemorative masses, and burial arrangements indicate that many were ultimately remembered less as political figures than as benefactors or devoted religious women. This transformation was not merely retrospective. Participation in charitable works, support for architectural projects, and engagement with devotional practices contributed to reshaping their public memory. Monasteries preserved these legacies through inscriptions and liturgical observances that emphasized reconciliation and piety. Nevertheless, surviving narratives reveal that confinement could remain psychologically complex even when material conditions were comfortable. Expressions of longing for familial connection, concern over political developments, and reflections on lost authority appear intermittently within devotional writings. These sources rarely provide explicit descriptions of emotional struggle, yet the persistence of petitions and correspondence suggests ongoing negotiation between acceptance and unresolved attachment to former roles. The quiet nature of these records reinforces the understated reality of confinement as a prolonged adjustment rather than a singular transformative event. In certain cases, monastic residents offered opportunities for former queens to exert influence within ecclesiastical reform movements. Patronage of new devotional practices, support for educational initiatives, and mediation in disputes between religious institutions appear in scattered documentary evidence. Such activities allowed queens to redirect forms of authority previously expressed through political governance into spiritual and charitable domains. Chroniclers occasionally acknowledge these contributions, framing them as evidence of sincere transformation, while simultaneously reinforcing the legitimacy of their removal from secular power. The broader political environment also shaped perceptions of confined queens among the general population. Popular memory, preserved in chronicles and later historical narratives, sometimes portrayed these women as victims of court intrigue or as exemplars of moral caution. These interpretations varied depending on regional loyalties, religious sentiment, and the eventual success or failure of the regimes responsible for their confinement. While official documentation emphasized order and reconciliation, informal narratives could preserve alternative perspectives that complicated the intended message of stability. Administrative measures designed to prevent escape or unauthorized communication appear sporadically within visitation records. Instructions regarding gate supervision, monitoring of correspondence, and regulation of travel between affiliated religious houses demonstrate the practical challenges of enforcing confinement within institutions not originally designed as prisons. The reliance on moral authority and communal discipline, rather than physical coercion, highlights the distinctive nature of monastic containment, where compliance was expected to arise from religious obligation as much as from political necessity. Comparative analysis across regions suggests that the effectiveness of monastic confinement depended heavily on the stability of the ruling regime. Periods of strong centralized authority tended to produce more consistent enforcement and clearer financial arrangements, while times of fragmentation or civil conflict increased the likelihood of negotiation, relaxation of restrictions, or even release. Surviving chronicles from such periods occasionally reference queens leaving monastic life to participate in diplomatic mediation, serve as advisors, or re-enter secular roles under altered circumstances. The intersection of age and confinement also influenced outcomes. Queens confined at a young age often spent decades within monastic environments, experiencing the gradual erosion of direct political relevance while developing alternative identities rooted in spirituality and patronage. Those confined later in life sometimes retained stronger connections to court networks and engaged more actively in correspondence related to ongoing political developments. These variations demonstrate that monastic confinement was not a uniform experience, but a flexible mechanism shaped by personal biography and shifting political priorities. Archaeological and architectural evidence from monasteries associated with royal residence provides additional insight into the spatial dimensions of confinement. Private chapels, separate gardens, and dedicated residential quarters suggest attempts to balance seclusion with recognition of status. These physical arrangements reinforced hierarchical distinctions within ostensibly egalitarian religious communities, illustrating how political considerations could reshape monastic space. The enduring presence of such modifications offers tangible reminders of the convergence between governance and religious life. The cumulative documentary record portrays monastic confinement as a process extending far beyond the initial act of removal from court. It involved sustained administrative oversight, ongoing negotiation with familial and diplomatic actors, and gradual adaptation within the rhythms of religious community. Queens confined under these circumstances navigated identities that combined elements of former authority, spiritual obligation, and symbolic relevance. Their experiences illuminate the subtle mechanisms through which medieval and early modern political systems managed instability while maintaining outward continuity and moral coherence. Over extended periods, the quiet continuity of monastic life often reshaped the political meaning attached to disgraced queens more profoundly than the initial act of confinement itself. Historical records indicate that time functioned as a stabilizing force within governance strategies, gradually diminishing immediate tensions while allowing new dynastic narratives to solidify. The queen's physical absence from court, combined with the predictable routines of enclosure, reduced opportunities for factional mobilization. Yet her symbolic presence endured in ways that required continued administrative awareness, particularly in relation to succession memory and the preservation of lineage. Surviving monastic necrologies and liturgical calendars reveal that former queens frequently became integrated into commemorative practices that reinforced both spiritual identity and dynastic remembrance. Annual masses, anniversary prayers, and charitable foundations established in their names suggest a deliberate effort to transform political displacement into a legacy framed by devotion and reconciliation. These practices were not solely expressions of personal piety. They contributed to broader narratives that depicted the resolution of political conflict as compatible with Christian ideals of repentance, forgiveness, and ordered hierarchy. Contemporary chronicles describe how the death of a confined queen often prompted careful management of burial arrangements and memorial representation. Decisions regarding burial location, funerary symbolism, and inscription language reflected ongoing political calculations. Burial within the monastery reinforced the narrative of withdrawal and spiritual completion, while inclusion of royal titles or heraldic imagery acknowledged enduring dynastic connections. Archaeological evidence from tomb sites demonstrates that even in death, these women occupied a liminal position between royal memory and monastic identity, neither fully erased from political history nor restored to former authority. Legal documentation indicates that property settlements connected to confined queens sometimes extended beyond their lifetimes. Wills and testamentary arrangements preserved in ecclesiastical archives reveal provisions for continued patronage of monastic institutions, distribution of personal devotional objects, and financial support for charitable initiatives.